They didn't raise flags. They didn't shout slogans. They didn't even fire a shot. But one day in June 2025, Canada was simply said gone. In a quiet corner of West Africa, something extraordinary just happened, and almost nobody in the West is talking about it. 5 of the richest gold mines in the region, all once run by powerful Canadian firms, were taken over by the government of Burkina Faso. No lawsuits, no buyouts, no apologies. What replaced them wasn't chaos. It was something far more revolutionary, a national mining company called SOAPAIB. For the first time, the gold under Burkinabe soil is no longer enriching foreign shareholders in Toronto or Geneva. It's funding schools, hospitals, roads, and jobs for the very people who live above it. This isn't some romantic tale of rebellion. It's a blueprint for a new kind of sovereignty, economic, operational, and unapologetically African. And here's the real shock: Burkina Faso didn't just survive without foreign mining corporations. It's thriving. Production hasn't stopped. Exports are still flowing. And the money is finally staying home. Ask yourself, if a country sitting on $3 billion worth of gold each year was once one of the poorest in the world, who was really profiting? And if this model works in Burkina Faso, who's next? You're watching a channel that doesn't speak for Africa? We listen to it. Please give this video a like if you believe nations should control their own resources. Share it with someone who still thinks Africa can't manage itself. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more powerful than the narrative. On August 12, 2024, while most of the world looked elsewhere, a single paragraph buried deep in a government bulletin changed everything. It was the official revision of Burkina Faso's National Mining Code. Just a bureaucratic update, some thought. But inside it was a time bomb, an unassuming clause that gave the state the right to hold up to 70% of any mining operation deemed strategic. It didn't make headlines. But to those watching closely, especially executives in Toronto and Montreal, it was the beginning of the end. For over a decade, Canadian mining companies had operated across West Africa with little resistance. The rules were written to favor them: generous tax breaks, long-term leases, minimal oversight. In Burkina Faso alone, companies like Endeavour Mining and Fortuna Silver Mines had built multi-million-dollar empires from gold extracted daily from deep beneath Burkinabe soil. The profits flowed out first as gold bars, then as dividends, then as returns to investors sitting comfortably in skyscrapers thousands of miles away. And all the while, Burkina Faso remained one of the poorest countries on earth. But the new government, led by Captain Ibrahim was not interested in symbolic reforms. It wanted control. And it moved quickly. By early 2025, foreign mining firms began to feel the pressure. New environmental audits were suddenly mandatory. Licensing delays began to stack up. Regulatory bodies once seen as passive were now asking hard questions. Local authorities began reasserting themselves. Every piece of bureaucracy that had once served foreign interests now shifted in tone. You may operate here, but only on our terms. Then came the silence. Companies like Simofo and Endeavour stopped issuing press releases about their long-term African partnerships. Investor reports grew vague. Canadian officials gave no interviews. But on the ground in Burkina Faso, change was accelerating. In March 2025, the government announced the formation of SOAPAIB, short for Société de Patrimoine Minier du Burkina. Translated, it means the Burkina Mining Heritage Corporation. But this wasn't just a shell company or a placeholder. It was designed from the ground up to take over everything. And it did. By June 2025, 5 of the most lucrative gold mines in the country, some producing hundreds of thousands of ounces per year, were officially under full state control. Canadian companies did not resist. They packed their offices. They shut down their operations. They left without legal battles, without arbitration, without a word. No compensation. No buyouts. Just silence. Why? Because Burkina Faso wasn't negotiating. It wasn't offering partial deals or backroom compromises. It wasn't begging for technical assistance or soft loans. It was making a declaration: this gold belongs to the people who live above it, and the world, at least for now, accepted it. Some firms like Fortuna Silver Mines quietly announced a shift in focus to Guinea. Others made vague mentions of regulatory uncertainty, but none admitted the truth: they had been outmaneuvered by a country they once viewed as dependent. It wasn't a revolution with guns and protests. It was a revolution of paperwork, law, and discipline. And it worked. The mines that had once funded luxury condos in Vancouver and hedge funds in London were now fueling the construction of public schools in rural Burkina Faso. The engineers who once took orders from Canadian managers were now reporting to Burkina Faso directors. The trucks, the loaders, the refining contracts all now flowed through government agencies or local companies brought in under a new model of national priority. Burkina Faso didn't just reclaim physical assets. It reclaimed the system, and perhaps most importantly, it proved that it could do it without collapse. There was no press conference, no televised announcement, no triumphant headline in the New York Times or the Financial Post. But on a hot June morning in 2025, the balance of power in African mining quietly collapsed. 5 gold mines, each worth hundreds of millions, were no longer Canadian. They weren't being transferred. They weren't sold. They were seized legally, silently, and irreversibly. And the world's response? Silence. That silence was louder than any speech. For decades, Canadian companies like Endeavour Mining and Fortuna Silver Mines had operated in Burkina Faso like colonial successors. Their names were on the trucks, the export contracts, the payrolls. Their influence ran so deep that decisions about Burkina Faso land were often made in offices 4,500 miles away in Toronto boardrooms, not Ouagadougou ministries. But now those same offices were empty, contracts had expired, and no new ones were coming. Equipment yards stood quiet. Executives who once dined with presidents were now told in no uncertain terms that they had no more business in Burkina Faso, and yet there was no legal battle. Because fighting back would have meant exposure. Canada knew it. The mining firms knew it. The West knew it. For years, their profits had come not just from minerals, but from imbalance, from laws written in foreign languages, from tax breaks that hurt locals, from environmental degradation that no one in Vancouver ever saw. To challenge Burkina Faso now would mean revisiting those deals, scrutinizing old contracts, investigating years of labor violations and environmental complaints that had gone unpunished. And in 2025, with global scrutiny rising and African youth more politically awake than ever, that was a risk none of them wanted to take. So they walked. Fortuna Silver Mines released a quiet statement they were shifting investment to Guinea. No mention of Burkina Faso. No mention of forced exit. Just a soft disappearance from a country that no longer needed them. Some executives tried to spin the story blaming security risks or regulatory volatility. But the truth was simpler, sharper. They were fired. And what replaced them wasn't chaos or decline. It was coordination. SOAPAIB, the national mining company created just months earlier, immediately took over all core operations, logistics, exports, workforce management. Production didn't stop. It barely dipped. Why? Because the same Burkina Faso engineers, operators, and geologists who once worked under foreign flags were still there, only now they worked for their own government. In Toronto, mining stocks dipped, quiet phone calls were made, CEOs warned their boards the African model is shifting. Investors watched billions in market capitalization evaporate, not because of violence, but because of sovereignty. It was the most organized resource takeover in modern African history and perhaps the most successful. But it didn't stop there. While the companies fell silent, a new kind of conversation started across Africa. In Mali, ministers began fast-tracking legislation to gain majority control over lithium and gold deposits. In Niger, the transitional government began auditing uranium contracts with French energy firms. And in Ghana and Congo, public debates intensified about whether foreign control of resources was truly worth the investment. Burkina Faso had lit a fuse, and the West hesitated. Canadian diplomats chose discretion over confrontation. There were no sanctions, no summits, no fiery condemnations from Ottawa. Western media barely covered the story, perhaps because admitting what happened would mean admitting that a so-called developing country had just outplayed the system. But people noticed. In Kenya, youth organizers cited the Burkina Faso model during protests. In South Africa, local mining unions demanded greater state equity in foreign-led operations. And across the diaspora from Detroit to Dakar, conversations began, if Burkina Faso can do it, what's stopping the rest? The climax wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense, it was bureaucratic, strategic, relentless. And that's what made it unstoppable. Burkina Faso didn't ask permission. It didn't scream rebellion. It rewrote the rules quietly, legally, and permanently. And as the dust settled, the world had to face a new reality. Africa isn't just rising, it's negotiating on its own terms. For decades, Burkina Faso's gold left the country as raw ore and came back, if it ever did, as promises. Promises of jobs, promises of investment, promises of progress. But the roads remained broken. Hospitals underfunded, schools crumbling in the Sahel wind. Now something is finally changing, not because someone gave Burkina Faso a grant, but because it took back what was already its own. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, SOAPAIB collected over 11 tons of gold from just the state-run mines and formalized small-scale operations. That's roughly $780 million USD in 3 months. Money that used to fund dividends in London is now repairing bridges in Bobo Dioulasso. Money that once lined retirement accounts in Quebec is now building clinics in Fada Ngurma. But this isn't just about money, it's about dignity. For the first time in living memory, Burkinabe citizens are seeing the wealth beneath their feet stay in their hands. It's showing up in visible, practical ways: rural schools getting solar panels and meals for children. Local roads near mining sites finally being paved by Burkinabe companies. New diagnostic equipment arriving in provincial hospitals stamped with funded by national gold revenue. And something else is changing, something deeper: the national psyche. And people are beginning to believe not in foreign aid, but in themselves. When gold stopped flying to Paris and started funding clean water projects, villagers didn't just cheer. They asked, what else can we reclaim? That's how revolutions begin, not always in the streets, but in the heart. Politically, the shift has redrawn lines of power inside the country. Ministries that once played passive roles in rubber-stamping foreign licenses now control entire sectors. Regional governors now negotiate directly with SOAPAIB on infrastructure planning, workforce integration, and community development. The political capital of the Traoré administration has soared. By proving that state-led projects can work and generate real results, it has silenced many critics both at home and abroad. And crucially, this transformation has not led to instability. Instead of layoffs and mine closures, SOAPAIB absorbed hundreds of Burkinabe workers who were already on-site: geologists, engineers, plant operators, drivers. These were not unskilled laborers. They were professionals who for years operated modern mining systems only to see the profits exported. Now they're building something new with ownership, accountability, and pride. Burkina Faso also shifted the civic narrative around mining. Under foreign ownership, mining often felt like extraction in the worst sense: take everything, leave nothing. Now communities near mining zones are part of planning committees. Village elders are consulted on infrastructure decisions. A share of local profits is reinvested directly into surrounding areas, not as charity, but as a right. And then there's the most radical part of all: the inclusion of small-scale miners. Historically, these miners, many of them families working shallow pits, were criminalized, pushed aside, or worse, forcibly removed. But SOAPAIB took a different approach: training them, registering them, creating a framework for legal, regulated, and sustainable operations. Because the government understood what foreign firms refused to see: wisdom doesn't only live in air-conditioned offices. It lives in the hands of people who have worked the land for generations. This inclusive model has generated goodwill, reduced local tensions, and created a hybrid mining economy where state-run operations and regulated artisanal miners coexist, collaborate, and profit. But every revolution has its risks. Running a national mining enterprise is expensive, technically demanding, and politically sensitive. Mistakes will happen. Corruption may tempt. Mismanagement can undo progress. Yet so far, SOAPAIB has moved with discipline. It has refused to overpromise. It has invested in training, not just extraction. It has partnered with local businesses for logistics, hauling, and maintenance, ensuring that more wealth circulates inside the economy. And crucially, it is building something most African resource sectors have never had: institutional memory. A government database of geological data, a generation of locally trained mining professionals, a paper trail of ownership, taxation, and impact tracking. These may sound boring, but this is how you build sovereignty, not in slogans, but in spreadsheets. In the end, what Burkina Faso is doing is more than just digging gold. It's building a nation. Not one that waits for help, not one that sells its wealth for temporary relief, but one that believes it can finally provide for its own. If you sit in Washington, D.C., this probably looks like a ripple. But if you look closely, it's an earthquake. Burkina Faso's decision to take full control of its mining sector isn't just a domestic victory, it's a global message. A message that's being heard whether Western powers choose to acknowledge it or not. For the United States, this raises uncomfortable questions. How stable is the supply chain for strategic minerals if African nations begin renegotiating the terms of access? How reliable are Canadian, European, or even American mining firms if they're being phased out, not by war, but by paperwork? And more importantly, what happens when African governments no longer need Western approval to manage their own resources? For over a century, the global mining industry has relied on a quiet assumption that expertise, capital, and control flow from north to south, from New York and London to Ouagadougou and Bamako. That model is crumbling. Now, when a European company wants gold for its electronics supply chain or a U.S. manufacturer needs cobalt for electric vehicles, they must negotiate with African governments on African terms. This shift is especially troubling for Canada. Ottawa has long seen Africa, particularly West Africa, as a zone of quiet influence. Canadian pension funds, engineering firms, and extraction companies have operated across the continent with little political friction. But Burkina Faso just showed that those arrangements can vanish overnight with no legal battle, no compensation, and no diplomatic leverage. And so far, no one in the West seems to know how to respond. The silence is telling. There have been no major statements from the U.S. State Department, no condemnation from the G7, no IMF warnings, at least not yet. Because this is not a traditional crisis. There is no war, no regime collapse, no refugee surge, just a country managing its resources better than expected. But the implications are massive. What happens when other African countries adopt the Burkina model? What happens to international investors when African courts, not arbitration centers in Paris, become the final word? What happens when resource nationalism is no longer framed as radical, but simply as reasonable? And here's the part that should truly worry Western institutions. It's working. Production is steady. Revenue is rising. Public support is growing. This isn't chaos, it's competence. And in a world where African sovereignty has often been treated as a slogan, Burkina Faso is turning it into a strategy. Not with a coup, not with a protest, but with a pen and a plan. What Burkina Faso just did may not make the front pages in New York or London, but it will be studied in boardrooms and foreign ministries for years to come. This wasn't just about gold. It was about the principle of who decides. For too long, the global contract between Africa and the West was written in invisible ink. A deal made generations ago, never questioned, never rewritten until now. Burkina Faso just picked up the pen, and the message is clear. The age of silent extraction is over. The mines are running. The workers are local. The gold stays home. And the silence from the West, that's not confidence. It's calculation. Because they know what this means. If one of Africa's smallest and poorest countries can do this, what happens when the others follow? This is more than a policy shift. It's a philosophical one. It's about rejecting the idea that progress must come from outside, that expertise must be imported, that profit must leave. And for older Americans watching this, those who remember Vietnam, the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, this might feel familiar. A world order that once seemed fixed begins to bend. A voice once ignored begins to lead. So we ask you now. Should more African nations reclaim direct control of their natural wealth? Was Canada right to walk away without a legal fight, or did they simply lose one? And most importantly, can we finally admit that African competence has never been the issue, only control has? Because if Burkina Faso continues on this path, it won't just change who owns the gold. It will change who owns the future. If you believe this is the kind of story the world should be talking about, share this video. Subscribe if you believe sovereignty matters more than headlines. And tell us in the comments, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's resource revolution is the beginning of a new Africa or just the beginning of the fight?